Ripple CEO, Brad Garlinghouse, just made some explosive statements about XRP and the crypto market. Could this be the signal we've all been waiting for? His insights could change the game for XRP holders and the entire crypto space. Let's break it all down and uncover what this means for the future of XRP.
Richard said, which is, on one hand, the US GDP is about 22% of global GDP, so there's 78% that in a lot of those jurisdictions have already been very pro-crypto. But I do also believe that the US has had an outsized impact and kind of just a negative influence, which has been super frustrating. And I think the Trump effect, I actually think is so far still underestimated. And now I always get nervous, and I heard somebody talking yesterday, and they're like, expectations are very high. And when expectations are high, I think more about downside than upside. But I think when the largest economy in the world is, I think, going to shift significantly, and I think there is going to be a Trump effect domestically, but the pun intended ripple effect of that outside the United States, I think, is going to be significant also, where it's just the U.S. has an outsized influence. And look, I think we are continuing to see, with only 4 or 5 days left of this administration, that Gary Gensler has not been acting in good faith. It has been, and I was talking to some people in the audience, and it would be nice to see some accountability at some point on some of these things. I don't think we will. I think people will move on, and to some degree, that's okay. We're going to be in a better place. But I think there's going to be renewed investment in the United States. I think you're going to see more, one of the key topics we're talking about is just unlocking the next 10 years. When the largest economy in the world and the institutions there feel handcuffs off, the business for Ripple in the United States has been frozen for 4 years. They filed a lawsuit in December 2020, and for the last 4 years, our ability to do business in the United States in terms of our signing institutions to use our technologies, it's basically been locked out.
Right.
And that's going to change.
And am I right in thinking that Ripple is already pushing back into the US? Pretty much as soon as the election result came in.
Yeah, beginning really in kind of the second half of 2020, most of our hiring was non-US. Last year, I think non-US hiring was like 78% of the company. Now, that's partly you follow where your customers are. Our business has 95% of our customers are non-US. I'm hopeful that, I've publicly shared that in the 6 weeks after the election, we signed more contracts in the United States than we had in the previous 6 months. So you're seeing, that's even before they've taken office, right? And so I think as we start to see the people that Trump has appointed take seat, affect change, I think we may have underestimated how those headwinds that we've all experienced are going to shift to tailwinds, and I'm very optimistic about what it's going to look like.
Right. And as for Gary Gensler's legacy, this kind of raft of cases against yourselves, against Kraken, Coinbase, Binance, and the rest, what do you expect to happen to those cases in the weeks and the months after Gensler leaves his seat?
Gensler likes to go out and talk about how they've won lots of cases. The reality is they've settled lots of cases because they're bullies, and there's very few people that can stand up to the bully of the United States government. There have been a handful, including Coinbase, and certainly including Ripple, who've stood up and have demonstrated that they have acted outside of what the law has said. And it's frustrating to not be able to have worked constructively and said, hey, look, is there gray area? Does the Howey test work here? Does a test from 1946, I think it was 46, 48, somewhere around there, does it make sense? I have already experienced personally, since the election, the outreach, the engagement with the people coming into office is very real, and they're trying to figure out, hey, let's figure out how to make this work. I think we will see a market structure bill in the United States. When I say market structure, for some people, that'll be, it's FIT 21 was the one that made the most progress. I think some derivative of FIT 21 will pass in the first 6 months. I think there'll be executive orders on day one around everything from SAB 121 to some of the choke point 2.0 stuff. I think it will happen quickly in many ways.
You really think day one? You think that?
I think day one there will be crypto-related executive orders.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay. Richard, when we were speaking a little bit about be all and end all, and to what extent do other factors need to be fit in him?
Well, I don't think it's the be all end all. I mean, I agree. Christian Carlos on stage earlier and commented on the U.S. regulatory environment that you're trying to regulate things we don't fully understand the implications of, right? Had the U.S. tried to regulate TCP/IP or HTTP in 1992, Like, well, we don't understand how these technologies are going to be used. And you kind of have to see how things evolve a little bit and then figure out, oh, okay, this is how we should apply a regulatory framework around that. I agree with that. That's not really how the U.S. has operated. I mean, as Richard said, I think you have mouthpieces that I would highlight Gary Gensler, but I'd highlight Elizabeth Warren, who are prognosticating, and it's just false facts. They're not telling the truth. They're talking about how it's all used for scams and what have you, and the data does not support it. So I think if you think about the unlock for the next 10 years, regulation's absolutely one of them, but that's obviously not enough. And I think that, focusing on utility and how we're actually using these technologies to solve real problems, super important. I think some of the stuff going on in tokenization, and another example where I think we've underestimated the impact. Those are the things I think really unlock. The last one I'll throw out, using the examples I used before, as we think about unlocking the next 10 years, making these technologies easier to use. The last panel was talking about as the UX. I guess that's part of it, but if we didn't have HTML and we were thinking about the expansion of TCP/IP in the early 90s, we wouldn't have the internet as we know it today. And I think we need to the UI layer and just the hiding the complexity. Everybody in this room probably at some point has done the equivalent of a penny test sending crypto. Like, really? At some point, I think we'll graduate beyond that, and there are already companies doing stuff in this space that I think is profound and will continue to see the market grow a lot.
Okay, let's dive a little bit deeper on that utility piece to make that a reality.
Well, I mean, I'll use Ripple. I mean, I never want to do a commercial for your own company, but I think what Ripple's been trying to do is go to institutions and deliver a service that their customers have no idea that the cross-border payment they just made went through crypto. And they shouldn't care. It was fast, it was cheap, it was very accurate, and to Richard's point earlier, it settles very, very quickly. The things that I think could be better, for those of us who self-custody, some of those technologies are hard. I heard horror stories, which I don't know if they're true, but people whose wallets were burned down in the fires in LA and their secret keys were in the safe that also is now melted. That on one hand, that's the nature of this technology. On the other hand, that's a deterrent to getting more and more people to participate in this.
Your grandmother is never going to be...
My slightly tongue-in-cheek answer to that is, if I knew the answer to that, I would go start another company and just focus on that. I mean, I'm being somewhat facetious about that, but I think we could all agree that the nature of how some of this, we expose some of the underlying technology to a consumer, and we can use your uncle, your grandmother, whatever. It's like it's too hard, and we want to invite them in. It is on the positive side. It is, as the U.S. regulatory framework changes and the ability for someone to say, I want to buy a Bitcoin ETF through my Fidelity account. Okay, that's not hard. People already know how to do that. But I think there's other examples, and I do think there's lots of entrepreneurs, some of them in this room, that are working on ways to make this more accessible to a larger audience.
Okay.
I mean, one Ripple is interested in, and we think a lot about, and because we are very focused on the enterprise and kind of institutional side, the ability to tokenize real-world assets and make them more accessible, more tradable. I think that is good for the global economy. I think it's good for consumers. I think it's good for businesses. I think it's good for institutions. And so I view that as an inevitability. And the question is, how quickly, which jurisdictions, where does it happen the most quickly? But I very much am a believer. And, again, you hear all kinds of crazy ideas about, like, what about tokenizing this? And it's stuff I've never thought of that I'm like, oh, yeah, I could see why that might make sense to a particular investor class or what have you. The one where Ripple doesn't participate, but I think is interesting, and I think players like Binance might end up being super successful, and I have no idea if they're working on this, but we don't really talk about consumer payment use cases, in large part because many of us come from economies that don't have hyperinflation, that the currency feels reasonably safe. Now, again, as pointed out, I think it was also Chris Giancarlo who said earlier that in the last 4 years, the U.S. government has printed 25% of all the money it's ever printed. And it's kind of like, oh my gosh, not a great factoid and trend line. But that's actually one of the good actors, relatively speaking, if you look at global players. So it'll be interesting. There's a broader experiment going on in Argentina, as an example, right now, where inflation has gone from very bad to not so bad. But look, if I lived in Argentina, I would be looking for opportunities to not hold the Argentinian peso. And you are seeing merchants who now list not just the Argentinian peso price, but a Bitcoin price. I think you will see the crypto leak into consumer use cases in markets that maybe we don't in kind of the G20 economies think as much about. And again, just an area where I think kind of we underestimate what might happen and over the next 10 years.
Right. So do you think it's a mistake to kind of look at crypto too closely through their own prism?
Yeah, for sure. I think Ripple. I mean, it's a natural effect. Like we live in the environments we are, and I think, as Richard described, he spends a lot of time traveling the world, so he sees firsthand some of these things that, unless you've sat down to a restaurant in Argentina and seen the menu list different currencies and how you can potentially pay, you don't kind of appreciate how much interest there might be in non-standard Argentinian peso kind of transactions. So I think that's true in all of life, where we grow up in our environment. And I've always said that people talk about crypto transactions. I remember people getting very excited in like 2016, 2017. I think Starbucks was going through like, hey, we're going to allow crypto payments. I remember thinking like, why would I do that? I got lots of ways to pay for my Starbucks in the morning, and none of them involve a crypto transaction for a whole bunch of reasons. But I'll leave it at that.
How do you think, Richard, about this?
Can I comment really briefly before you dive in?
Yeah.
I mean, you are appropriately calling we're in a bull market. I get it. There's another way to look at it. Gary Gensler's knee on the neck of the crypto industry was a $1 trillion knee. And so another way to look at it is there's not actually in a bull. It's just it's a recovery from a malfeasance attacking an industry that now it's like, oh, okay, that's gone, and now we've kind of reset. I mean, one of the things we were talking about backstage is if you look at the rally, it's been absolutely led by US-related cryptos who have been at the forefront of the attack from the US government. And it's like, okay, those are coming off, and so those have outperformed the rest of the market. That sounds logical to me. It doesn't sound like, and in some ways, I would even argue the whole market is not actually, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of positive activity. I see people laughing. I'm afraid to ask what's it.
Definitely. We better turn around.
Most of what I will say right now I've said publicly, but look, the reality, most companies that go public do that to raise capital. We haven't needed to raise capital, and so that has not been a driving force. We have talked a little bit about would we go public, and it's like, well, the U.S. market until recently has been very hostile, and like, why would we even try to have that conversation? I mean, I guess the exact answer to the question, will we IPO in 2025? I think that's a definitive no.
Okay.
We're in 2025, and it certainly takes a little bit of time to get there. But I also think you have to ask yourself, okay, how does Ripple benefit from being a public company? And therefore, is it a high priority for us? So what we've said is there's no imminent plans to go public. I will acknowledge that a change in the SEC in the United States, as he said earlier, as conditions change, you never say never, and you reevaluate as you learn new facts.
Okay, doesn't sound like a no.